in the shadowed corridors of a medieval castle perched high above the river Mulde, where the wind howled through iron bars like the ghosts of forgotten battles. A young British officer named Airey Neave stared at the unyielding stone walls that the Germans had deemed escape-proof. It was the summer of 1941, and Neave, captured nearly a year earlier in the chaos of France's fall, had already slipped the bonds of captivity twice before, only to be dragged back into the abyss of imprisonment. Now, in this fortress of the incorrigible, surrounded by fellow officers who whispered plans in the dead of night and sketched maps on scraps of toilet paper, Neave felt the weight of defiance stir within him, a quiet fire kindled not by rage, but by an unshakable belief that freedom was not a gift from the victors, but a right seized by the unbroken. This is the story of Major Airey Neave, the man who walked out of Colditz not once, but through attempts that tested the limits of plast and ingenuity and resolve, revealing the human spirit's quiet rebellion against the machinery of war, and how those shadows of captivity would shape a life cut tragically short, echoing long after the guns fell silent. Airey Middleton Sheffield Neave entered the world on the 23rd of January 1916 in the elegant bustle of Knightsbridge, London, the son of Sheffield Airey Neave, a distinguished entomologist whose studies of butterflies took him to distant corners of the empire, and Dorothy Middleton, whose family traced roots to the merchant barons of the West Indies in the 18th century. The Neaves were a lineage of quiet achievement, elevated to baronetcy for their contributions to trade and science, yet it was in the rolling Buckinghamshire countryside of Beaconsfield, where the family relocated, that young Airey found his footing amid ancient oaks and winding lanes. From the preparatory halls of St. Ronan's School in Worthing, he advanced to the storied playing fields of Eton College in 1929, where the air hummed with the echoes of empire and the unspoken expectations of privilege. Eton shaped him not just in classics and cricket, but in the subtle arts of leadership and observation. As a cadet lance corporal in the officer training corps, he learned the cadence of command, the weight of a rifle on a drill square, and the thrill of mock maneuvers that foreshadowed the real storms to come. It was there, in 1933, that Neave penned a prize-winning essay foreseeing the dark harvest of Adolf Hitler's ascent, a chilling prophecy of militarism's march across Europe, born from his own travels to Germany, where he had witnessed the Nuremberg rally's hypnotic fervor and the creeping shadow of totalitarianism. Those experiences lingered like a premonition, sharpening his mind for the conflicts ahead. By 1935, Neave had matriculated to Merton College, Oxford, to pursue jurisprudence, though his part was already turning toward the drumbeat of duty. The university's dreaming spires offered a brief interlude of intellectual pursuit, but Neave's thoughts drifted to strategy and statecraft. He devoured Karl von Clausewitz's On War, absorbing its cold logic that conflict was an extension of politics by other means, and declaring to friends that with war on the horizon, one must master its grim algebra. His academic efforts were modest, a third-class degree in 1938, but they masked a growing resolve. That December, he accepted a territorial commission as second lieutenant in the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, a regiment steeped in the island's martial traditions. By May of the following year, he transferred to the Royal Engineers, drawn to the precision of sapping and mining, the hidden arts of fortification and demolition that turned earth into weapon. When war erupted on the 3rd of September 1939, Neave was ready, mobilized. Into the 1st Searchlight Regiment of the Royal Artillery, his nights soon filled with the arc of searchlights probing the blackout skies over England. The phony war's uneasy truce shattered in May 1940 as Hitler's blitzkrieg tore through the Low Countries and into France. Neave, now a lieutenant, crossed the Channel with his battery, tasked with illuminating the night for anti-aircraft guns along the scarred coast near Calais. The port city, a vital artery for the Dunkirk evacuation, became a cauldron of desperation as German panzers of the 10th Division encircled the Allied rearguard. On the 22nd of May, amid the thunder of Stuka dive bombers and the relentless grind of tracks on cobblestone, Neave's unit dug in amid the dunes and warehouses, their searchlights now beacons in a futile stand. Shells rained down, turning streets to rubble and men to shadows. Neave, directing fire from a shattered battery position, felt the ground shudder as German infantry closed in, bayonets glinting in the smoke. Wounded by shrapnel that tore through his leg, he refused evacuation, urging his gunners to hold until the last rounds were spent. But the tide was inexorable. As dawn broke on the 23rd, with ammunition exhausted and the harbour choked with burning wrecks, Neave was taken prisoner. One of over 45,000 British troops surrendered in the siege of Calais, a sacrifice that bought precious hours for the miracle at Dunkirk. The humiliation burned deep. Marched away under guard, his hands bound and uniform bloodied, Neave vowed silently that captivity would not define him. It was the beginning of a defiance that would carve his name into the annals of resistance. The journey into captivity was a descent into a world of barbed wire and barked orders, where the Geneva Convention's promises clashed with the reality of German efficiency. Neave's first holding camp was Oflag 9A/H, a converted castle near Spangenberg in Hesse, a sprawling edifice of turrets and courtyards that echoed with the footsteps of defeated officers from across the Allied ranks. Here, in the summer of 1940, the initial shock of defeat gave way to a grim routine. Roll calls at dawn under the scrutiny of goons, the prisoners' slang for guards' meals of watery ersatz coffee and black bread, and evenings spent in cramped rooms debating the war's course over smuggled cigarettes. Neave, his wound bandaged but throbbing, observed it all with the lawyer's eye he would later hone at the bar. The guards' routines, the blind spots in patrols, the subtle hierarchies among the inmates. Oflag 9A was no fortress of the damned, but a transit point, and Neave's mind turned early to escape. It was a duty etched into every British officer's code, not mere adventure, but a strategic imperative to harass the enemy, gather intelligence, and deny the Reich its captives' labour. Yet the first stirrings were tentative. Whispers in the mind, latrines about tunnelling under the walls, or bribing a sympathetic turnkey. By February 1941, Neave was transferred eastward to Stalag 20A, near Thorn in occupied Poland, a vast barrack complex ringed by watchtowers and double fences, where the Polish winter bit like a wolf and the guards grew harsher with each rumour of Soviet advances. Stalag 20A held thousands, a polyglot of British, French and Polish unfortunates, their days a monotonous grind of Appell, endless headcounts and nights haunted by the distant rumble of trains carrying fresh deportees. Neave, now adapting to the POW's economy of barter and boredom, found allies in men like Norman Forbes, a fellow artilleryman with a quick wit and sharper eye for detail. Together, they plotted in the shadows of the long barracks, sketching layouts on cigarette papers and testing the soil for tunnelling. The plan coalesced in April, a simple disguise, leveraging the chaos of a work party detail. Neave and Forbes donned civilian clothes pilfered from Red Cross parcels, rough wool trousers and threadbare jackets, and slipped away during a supervised march to a nearby rail yard, melting into the twilight haze of the Vistula River flats. For 3 days they trudged eastward, hearts pounding at every distant engine whistle, scavenging for food from farmsteads, and navigating by stars toward the Soviet lines. The thrill of open sky was intoxicating, a reclaiming of agency in a world stripped bare. But freedom proved fleeting. Near the village of Ilo, Gestapo agents tipped by a suspicious peasant ambushed them in a barn, rifles levelled in the lantern light. The interrogation that followed was a descent into psychological warfare. Hours of hectoring questions in broken English, threats of the Eastern Front's horrors, and the cold certainty that recapture meant harsher chains. The Gestapo's cells in Thorn were a prelude to retribution, dank stone rooms where the air hung heavy with damp and despair, and Neave first tasted the isolation that could break lesser men. Yet it was there, in the flicker of a candle stub, that he began to study his captors not as monsters, but as fallible functionaries, men with routines, vanities, and blind spots. Released after a week to the Wehrmacht's custody, Neave and Forbes were branded habitual escapers, their files stamped with the red ink of the incorrigible. In May 1941, they were bundled onto a train rattling through the heart of the Reich, destination a place whispered about in POW lore, Colditz Castle, O-Flag 4C, the Germans' vault for the uncrushable. As the locomotive chugged past bombed-out Ruhr factories and verdant Saxon hills, Neave gazed out the barred window, the landscape blurring into resolve. Captivity had taught him patience, but also the fragility of control. Each failed bid was a lesson in forgery, in the mimicry of gait and gesture that could unlock a gate. Colditz, he sensed, would be the ultimate test, not just of body, but of that inner compass pointing always toward the horizon. Colditz Castle loomed like a sentinel from a Gothic tale, its honey-coloured walls and jagged turrets crowning a sheer cliff above the sleepy town of Colditz in Saxony, a medieval stronghold converted in 1940 into a prison for the Reich's most troublesome officers. The Germans called it a Sonderlager, a special camp, but to the inmates it was the bad boys' school, a repository for those who had already tunneled from Dulag Luft transit camps, slipped disguises past sentries at Spangenberg, or bartered their way across the Dutch frontier. Perched 300 feet above the Mulde River, its approaches a labyrinth of ravines and razor wire, Colditz was guarded by 200 goons under the command of Captain Reinhold Eggers, a former schoolmaster with a penchant for poetry and a paranoia sharpened by each thwarted plot. Floodlights swept the courtyards at night, Alsatian dogs patrolled the perimeter, and every parcel was X-rayed for contraband. Yet within its confines, a culture of defiance bloomed like contraband cigarettes in the black market, a sub-rosa society where escape was not rebellion, but sacrament. Neave arrived on the 14th of May 1941, stepping from the guarded truck into a courtyard alive with the murmur of accents. Clipped British Oxbridge tones mingling with French Gallic flair, Dutch pragmatism and Polish fire. The British contingent, some 30 strong at first, occupied the northwest wing, their rooms a warren of oak-beamed cells overlooking the river's glint. Here, Neave met the pantheon of persistence. Pat Reed, the wiry escape officer who chronicled their saga. Douglas Bader, the legless fighter ace whose indomitable spirit mocked his crutches. And a chorus of lieutenant colonels and majors who had once commanded battalions, now reduced to plotting with compasses fashioned from razor blades. Life in Colditz was a delicate balance of tedium and tension. Mornings began with appel, the ritual head count where officers stood ramrod straight under Eggers's gaze, afternoons filled with contrived pursuits, tennis on a makeshift court, chess tournaments that doubled as code sessions, or lectures on Shakespeare, delivered with maps concealed in the folios. Evenings brought the real work. In the attic ateliers, forgers like the Dutch artist Van Doornink etched rubber stamps from erasers, while tailors unpicked German uniforms smuggled via laundry swaps, dyeing wool with tea leaves and boot polish to mimic Feldgrau. The Escape Committee, a shadow cabinet chaired by Reed, vetted plans with military precision, prioritizing those with the highest odds tunnels bored by Polish sappers using table knives, gliders sketched on rice paper for a rooftop launch that never came, or the wooden horse that masked a shaft into the cellars. MI9, the War Office's clandestine arm for evasion and escape, was the invisible patron saint of this underground. From London, officers like Major Norman Crocat orchestrated a lifeline of ingenuity, embedding compasses in button brass, silk maps in Monopoly board games disguised as charity parcels, and miniature saws in pencils. These gifts arrived via the International Red Cross, their contents vetted to evade suspicion, and in Colditz's parcel room, inmates bartered fiercely for the laced tins of bully beef or packs of playing cards printed with escape routes. Neave, with his lawyer's mind and engineer's training, gravitated to the forger's den, studying Gestapo-issue Ausweis papers, pilfered from careless guards, and practicing the flourish of Teutonic script. But Colditz was more than machinations. It was a forge for the soul. In the summer of 1941, as reports filtered in of Vichy France's collaboration, the Germans decreed the separation of 80 French Jewish officers, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals from their Gentile comrades, herding them into a stifling attic under the pretext of racial purity. The British, incensed, staged a protest dinner in their mess, inviting the isolated men to a feast of tinned sardines and ersatz cake. Neave, rising with glass in hand, delivered a speech that cut through the room like a bayonet, denouncing prejudice as the coward's creed, affirming solidarity in shared captivity. It was a small act, but in the castle's pressure cooker it bound the nations tighter, reminding all that the war's true enemy was division itself. Neave's first bid for freedom from Colditz came on the 28th of August, 1941, a scheme born of impatience and the summer's languid heat. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Impersonate a German non-commissioned officer, leveraging the chaos of a routine guard change. With Forbes and a Polish ally, Neave commandeered a Polish army tunic from the theatre stores. Its khaki dyed a passable feldgrau with inks mixed from vegetable dyes and boot blacking. A cap was improvised from cardboard stiffened with porridge glue, adorned with insignia painted in scenery oils, and a belt fashioned from silvered leather scraps. In the pre-dawn gloom of the British quarters, they rehearsed the bluff, stiff-armed salutes, barked orders in halting German learned from phrasebooks, and eavesdropped conversations. Heart-hammering, Neave slipped into the corridor, the disguise a second skin that itched with uncertainty. The courtyard lay still under searchlight sweep, goons yawning at their posts. But as he crossed the threshold, the beams caught the paint's sheen, turning the uniform a lurid green under the arc lamps, a spectral glow that froze the sentries in alarm. "Halt!" rang out, rifles snapping up. Neave bolted for the shadows, but the game was lost. Cornered in an alcove, he was dragged back, the cardboard cap tumbling like a fallen crown. Captain Eggers, summoned from his quarters, surveyed the farce with wry amusement, quipping that Corporal Neave was destined for the Russian front. Solitary confinement followed a bread and water vigil in a windowless cell, where the walls pressed like a vice, but Neave emerged leaner, wiser, his failure a textbook in optics and timing. The attempt branded him further as a ghost in the machine, but it also honed the blade of persistence. In the mess that evening, over mugs of acorn coffee, Reed clapped his shoulder, murmuring that every bust was a blueprint for breakthrough. The months that followed were a crucible of calculation, where Neave's nights blurred into days of meticulous preparation. Colditz's rhythm revealed its fractures. The guard's penchant for schnapps-fueled lapses. The laundry truck's weekly rumble that masked hammer strikes. The theatre's trapdoor, a relic from pre-war operettas that yawned beneath the stage like a secret vein. Neave, partnering with the Dutch Lieutenant Anthony Lutin, a fluent German speaker with a forger's finesse, refined the blueprint. Lutin, captured after the fall of the Netherlands, brought the precision of Delft engineering. Together, they pored over pilfered timetables, memorizing train schedules from Leipzig to the Swiss frontier. The disguises evolved. No hasty dyes this time, but authentic Wehrmacht greatcoats, bartered from a sympathetic orderly, epaulettes embroidered with dental floss, and forged papers etched on onion skin tracing paper, complete with rubber-stamped seals moulded from soap. They posed as wounded Arbeitskommando workers, labor conscripts from the Eastern Territories, bandages concealing compasses, their limp a practiced sham to evoke pity at checkpoints. Rehearsals unfolded in the attic's gloom, Neave barking orders in guttural Deutsch, Lutin coaching the subtleties of regional dialects, their voices echoing off rafters like conspirators in a Renaissance intrigue. Risk shadowed every stitch. Discovery meant the cooler, or worse, transfer to the Gestapo's tender mercies. Yet in those stolen hours, Neave found a clarity amid the confinement, a meditation on freedom not as absence of chains, but presence of choice, the will to act when all doors seemed bolted. January 1942 dawned bitter, the Mulde iced over, and the castle's stones weeping frost. The theatre production, a morale-boosting review of Gilbert and Sullivan's snippets, provided the veil. On the evening of the 4th, as the audience of officers chuckled at a skit lampooning Goering's girth, Neave and Lutin waited in the wings, hearts sinking to the orchestra's scrape. The curtain fell on Act 2. Amid applause, they slipped backstage, prying the trapdoor with a filed spoon. The shaft dropped 15 feet into the guardroom basement, a fetid crawl space reeking of damp plaster and rat droppings. On hands and knees, uniforms snagging on nails, they inched through the murk, emerging into the guardhouse anteroom where oblivious sentries warmed their hands by a stove. Donning the disguises, peaked caps shadowing their faces, greatcoats buttoned against the chill they straightened, saluting a startled Unteroffizier with clipped precision. Transport detail for the injured? Lutin intoned in flawless Berliner, Neave nodding gravely beside him. The bluff held, waved through the sally port. They marched into the night, the castle's floodlights fading like a receding dream. Freedom's first breath was electric, the crunch of snow under civilian boots, a symphony of liberation. But the road ahead was a gauntlet. Leipzig's Hauptbahnhof, thronged with Wehrmacht transients and Gestapo shadows, where a wrong glance could unravel all. The train to Leipzig was a steel serpent of peril, its compartments a microcosm of the Reich fraying seams, wounded veterans nursing bandaged limbs, civilians muttering of ration queues, and officers eyeing strangers with suspicion born of saboteur whispers. Neave and Lutin, swaddled in their roles as convalescent labourers from the Polish front, huddled in a third-class carriage, false papers clutched like talismans. The conductor's punch was a formality, but at Dessau, a patrol boarded, jackboots echoing as they demanded Ausweis. Lutin's hand trembled slightly as he proffered the forgeries, Neave interjecting with a fabricated tale of shrapnel scars and factory reassignment. The Unteroffizier's gaze lingered, then flicked away boredom's mercy granting passage. Dawn broke over the Thuringian forests as they changed at Erfurt, the platform a hive of porters and propaganda posters blaring of victories in the east. On foot now, skirting villages where Luftwaffe conscripts drilled in the meadows, they pressed south toward Ulm, the Danube's silver thread their lodestar. Hunger gnawed, appeased by pilfered apples from orchards, thirst slaked at streams that tasted of iron and liberty. Checkpoints multiplied near the border. Singen, the gateway to Switzerland, a town of clockmakers and smugglers where the Rhine's roar masked illicit crossings. Disguised as travelling salesmen, peddling bootleg textiles, they bartered cigarettes for a farmer's cart, jolting over rutted lanes as patrols prowled the hedgerows. The final leg was a vigil of shadows and silence. On the night of the 8th of January, under a moon veiled by scudding clouds, Neave and Lutin approached the frontier near Schaffhausen, the Swiss lights twinkling like distant stars across the wire. The border was a scar of floodlights and tripwires, patrolled by frontier guards whose rifles caught the gleam of snow. Crawling through a drainage culvert, mud caking their knees, they emerged into no man's land, a 200-yard kill zone of open fields where a snapped twig could summon death. Hearts thundering, they inched forward on bellies, the wire's barbs snagging sleeves like vengeful fingers. A sentry's beam swept perilously close, freezing them in place, breaths held until it passed. Then, with a final surge, they breached the line, tumbling into Swiss neutrality as dawn's first blush painted the hills. Exhausted, half frozen, they staggered to a farmhouse where the farmer, roused by their knocks, ushered them to the authorities in Bern. 84 hours from Colditz's gates, Neave sipped tea in a consular office, the absurdity of safety washing over him like absolution. Lutin clasped his hand, their partnership forged in secrecy, now sealed in triumph, the first British duo to pierce Colditz's veil. Repatriation was a whirlwind of debriefings and disbelief. From Switzerland, Neave crossed into Vichy, France, then slipped through the Pyrenees into Spain, a trek of mule paths and mountain passes, aided by Comet Line guides, those brave civilians who shepherded evaders at peril of their lives. Gibraltar's rock loomed as a bastion of empire, its tunnels echoing with the cheers of returning warriors. By April 1942, Neave touched English soil at Plymouth, the Channel's chop, giving way to the familiar reign of home. The War Office hailed him as a prodigal, decorated with the Military Cross on the 12th of May, its citation lauding his outstanding courage and resource in a ceremony where King George VI pinned the ribbon to his tunic. But accolades were fleeting. Neave's mind turned to the men still caged in Colditz, their faces haunting his dreams. Recruited to MI9, the shadowy directorate of escape and evasion, he became a linchpin in the underground railroad that spanned occupied Europe. From a nondescript office in James's Street, Neave orchestrated the flow of aids. Compasses sewn into uniform hems, escape packs dropped to downdraft pilots in fields from Normandy to the Low Countries. He liaised with the Pat O'Leary line, a Belgian-French network that funneled 5,000 allies to safety via Spain, and the Comet line, whose couriers, nuns and schoolgirls under the radar evaded Gestapo sweeps with forged laissez-passer mirroring his own. As D-Day loomed in June 1944, Neave plunged back into the fray with Operation Marathon, parachuting into liberated Belgium to coordinate rescues from forest hideouts where airmen sheltered amid the Ardennes gloom. For 3 months, he traversed enemy lines in a jeep daubed with false plates, haggling with resistance cells for safe houses and bribing collaborators with gold sovereigns. Over 300 souls owed their lives to those run's flyboys with frostbitten feet, their eyes wide with the miracle of deliverance. Neave's reports flooded Whitehall, sketches of Gestapo outposts, codes for radio drops, analyses of border patrols that saved countless more. Yet the work scarred him. Each briefing evoked Colditz's chill, the faces of comrades left behind Reed, Bader, Sinclair, whose glider dreams and drag disguises would follow in his wake. By war's end, promoted to temporary major, Neave stood at Nuremberg in 1945, his fluent German transforming him from escaper to inquisitor. As a prosecutor for the International Military Tribunal, he delved into the Krupp armaments empire, cross-examining war criminals whose factories had forged the chains he once broke. Reading indictments to the dock, Goering's sneer, Ribbentrop's pallor, Neave felt the wheel turn full circle, the escaper now judge in the court of history. The armistice brought no respite. Neave's odyssey continued in the corridors of power, where the lessons of captivity informed a life of unyielding principle. Demobilized in 1946 with the Distinguished Service Order for his MI9 exploits, he channeled his energies into the law, called to the bar at the Inner Temple in 1953 after nights of poring over precedents by lamplight. His chambers in the Strand became a haven for veterans seeking redress. Neave's advocacy, a quiet extension of the Barters in Colditz's attics. Politics beckoned that same year when a by-election in Abingdon thrust him into Parliament as a Conservative MP, his maiden speech a clarion against appeasement's ghosts. For 26 years, he navigated the Commons' tempests. Under Secretary for Air in 1959, where he championed radar upgrades echoing his searchlight days. Transport Minister's aide, streamlining the railways that had once borne him to freedom. A heart attack that year sidelined him briefly, but Neave returned fiercer, his parliamentary interventions laced with the precision of a forger's stamp, incisive on defence, sceptical of the common market's embrace, a voice for the forgotten in a post-war boom. By the 1970s, Neave's star aligned with Margaret Thatcher's ascent, his loyalty forged in the smoke-filled rooms of Conservative Central Office. As her shadow cabinet enforcer and Northern Ireland spokesman from 1974, he plotted her leadership bid with the strategist's eye, outmanoeuvring rivals in 1975 to crown the Iron Lady. Whispers abounded of his hawkish views on Ulster, talk of internment's iron fist and devolved assemblies, but Neave saw in the province's strife a mirror to captivity's moral quandaries, the line between security and tyranny, the cost of defiance. On the 30th of March 1979, as Big Ben tolled noon, Neave steered his Vauxhall Cavalier from the House of Commons' underground garage, bound for a lunch with Enoch Powell. The blast shattered the concrete vault, a Mercury tilt car bomb, its fuse triggered by the incline, exploding with a force that sheared his legs and filled the air with acrid fire. Rushed to Westminster Hospital, he lingered an hour, aged 63, his last breaths a murmur to aides of unfinished business. The Irish National Liberation Army claimed the deed, their statement a venomous coda to a life of quiet insurgency. Some devils got him. No arrests followed. The files seal until 2079, shadows lingering over allegations of infiltration and betrayal. Airey Neave's legacy is a tapestry woven from wire and will, a testament to the escaper's art that transcended the camps to touch the levers of state. In the annals of Colditz, he stands as the first Briton to breach its ramparts. His January 1942 dash, not just a personal triumph, but a spark for the 30-odd souls who followed French paratroopers in drag, Poles on homemade gliders, Dutch commandos in wooden steeds. His book, They Have Their Exits, published in 1953, immortalized that fraternity, its pages a paean to the POW's unquenchable thirst for the open road, blending dry wit with the ache of what was lost. In MI9's ledgers, Neave's hand guided thousands home, his Singan route a lifeline etched in smuggled silk. And in Parliament, his voice measured, unyielding championed the underdog, from airmen's widows to Ulster's beleaguered, until silenced by shadows he had once outrun, assassinated on the cusp of cabinet, Neave embodied the escaper's paradox, freedom's price paid in vigilance eternal. Today, as Colditz's ruins draw pilgrims to its cliffs, Neave's story whispers that captivity is not walls alone, but the mind's surrender, and in refusing that, one reclaims not just liberty, but the soul's quiet sovereignty. In the end, Airey Neave did not merely escape. He lived as if every day were a border crossed, every dawn a defiance renewed, leaving behind a world forever marked by the man who walked through stone.